Invasive species are more than just unwelcome guests. They can crowd out and eliminate other species entirely and end up the last one standing in the battle for space, food, and water. Now, when I say last one standing, I think it might be more appropriate to say something like last worm wiggling. And while that doesn't sound super intimidating, I'll throw it to Hank to explain how the earthworm is a destructive invasive species.
Earthworms have a pretty great reputation. They help create rich soil in your gardens, they make for a great home composting system, they're fantastic bait if you're into fishing, and sometimes they crawl into a corner of your office and die, which happens to me like 3 times a week. The problem is, much of North America has gotten along just fine without them for thousands of years. Across much of the northern US and most of Canada, there are no native earthworms. Most likely because they were wiped out during the most recent glacial period. The Ice Age didn't wipe out all North American earthworms. There's still nearly 100 native species in the southern and far western United States. But they just never really re-established themselves in the Northeast. But thanks to human activity, North America now has at least 45 introduced earthworm species, mostly from Europe, that are spreading into these previously worm-free areas. And while we might be under the impression that worms are beneficial, these introduced earthworms are actually reshaping our forests from the ground up. A study in New York in 2017 found that invasive earthworms dramatically changed the nutrient composition of the forest soils tested there, and weirdly enough, it was by increasing the availability of some nutrients like calcium, potassium, and magnesium at shallow depths. Now, you might expect releasing nutrients from plant debris back into the soil would be a good thing, but it isn't. Earthworms aren't exactly built for speed, and for whatever reason, any earthworms that were around before the glaciers wiped them out have been super slow to move back in, giving these ecosystems time to adjust. Without earthworms, these forest floors have a thick layer of organic material that builds up over years. This layer helps prevent soil erosion, supports plant germination, and provides habitat for many organisms that evolved to survive in these nutrient-depleted conditions. But non-native earthworm species have spread far and wide. They don't travel fast on their own, but humans have introduced them repeatedly over centuries. And the activity of these invaders mixes soil layers, distributes nutrients deeper into the soil, and leaves behind nutrient-dense worm poop. We might want that in our flower beds and veggie gardens, but native forest plants growing in the understory near the ground aren't used to these conditions and they get stressed out. And their effect has been pretty widespread. One paper from 2020 compared 40 studies that looked at soil chemistry changes caused by introduced earthworms in diverse environments. They found that across the board, in addition to changing nutrient concentrations, these earthworms are increasing soil pH and decreasing soil water content. And it's not just understory plants. These changes to the soil are messing with some trees and their natural defenses against pests. A different 2020 study found that a high population of earthworms decreased concentrations of some defensive chemicals in balsam poplar saplings. Those chemicals would normally help protect the trees from leaf-chewing insects. Earthworms are causing more direct harm to plants as well. Maybe you don't exactly think of earthworms as fierce predators, but to a plant they can be. In one study published in Biological Invasions in 2016, invasive earthworms devoured or destroyed 73% of the seeds from 6 important temperate forest plant species. This means that earthworms could be directly influencing the composition of plant communities by disrupting them before they sprout. Their impacts don't stop at plants either. You might think birds would enjoy having more worms around because they're big, juicy packages of yum. But a study of ground-nesting ovenbirds conducted in the northern US found that more invasive worms meant fewer ovenbirds. It's unclear exactly why the presence of earthworms is affecting these birds, but there are a few hypotheses. One is that predators might be finding their nests more easily since there's less built-up leaf litter when worms are around, spoiling their camouflage. And if that wasn't bad enough with all these European earthworms, there's a second wave of invasive worms native to Asia, and they're posing a new threat to forests. These more recent arrivals started showing up in North America in the 19th century. They're also known as jumping worms, and they are spreading largely thanks to gardening and recreational fishing. Researchers have found that these jumping worms can outcompete the existing earthworm population, which, when one invasive invasive species can show a different invasive species the door, that's not a great sign. Not only that, they alter soil composition in a unique way, even in soils previously invaded by other earthworm species, further changing the soil bacteria and fungal communities. This adds even more complexity to an already complex issue, since we now know that different species of earthworms can cause unique threats to forest ecosystems. We're still learning what effects introduced earthworms have on forests, but they have the potential to be huge. They could alter the ability of the forest to regulate CO2, decrease water quality, and help other invasive species take hold, among other unknowns. The good news is that researchers are looking to better understand the patterns of invasion of earthworms, creating models to more accurately predict where they're heading, which can help forest managers prepare. Unfortunately, once earthworms are introduced to a forest, it's not possible to stop the spread. That said, we can take steps to try to stop introducing them into new environments. Like if you're on a camping trip, one way to help stop the spread is by cleaning your vehicle tires when changing locations, since eggs can hitch a ride. And if you're fishing, don't just dump your bait when you're done. Ultimately, we'll need to learn more about the impacts earthworms are having on North American forests to best manage their spread. But those innocent little wigglers sure are a lot more trouble than I imagine you assumed.
So earthworms are no joke. It's easy to underestimate those tiny little critters. But animals aren't the only invasive species out there. There's an oversized invasive carrot that can kill its neighbor plants and invade our DNA.
In the roadsides and ditches of New York State lurks a plant straight out of your worst nightmare. It's a relative of the carrot, but this carrot can grow to be over 4 meters tall, and if you're not careful, it could send you to the hospital with third-degree burns. Not only is it dangerous to humans, it's also really good at crowding out native species. It's called giant hogweed, and it's one plant you don't want to mess with. Giant hogweed is native to the Caucasus Mountains in Western Asia. It was introduced to Europe in the late 19th century and to the US early in the 20th century because people thought it would look cool in their garden. It can get really tall, has leaf arrays that are up to 1.5 meters wide, and white flower heads that can be as big as 3/4 of a meter across. So yeah, I guess you could say it's pretty remarkable looking, but inevitably, it busted out of people's backyard garden plots and started to grow wild, usually along streams and roadsides. Today, it's established in parts of Europe, southern Canada, and the US. It's especially widespread in New York, but it's been spotted in about a dozen states, including all the way across the country in reigning Washington. What makes giant hogweed so dangerous is its sap, which can get on you if you break the stems or leaves, or even just brush up against the bristles on its stems. The sap contains organic compounds called furanocoumarins that can penetrate your skin cells, getting right up into the nuclei alongside the cell's DNA. If these compounds are then hit by ultraviolet radiation, like sunlight, they can absorb some of the light's energy and trigger 2 of the nucleotides in DNA, thymine and cytosine, to form cross-links in your DNA strands that really shouldn't be there. Enough of these unwelcome disruptions, and the cells stop working. Hogweed's relatives actually produce these nasty compounds too, but usually at lower levels. Though people have reported burns similar to hogweed from contact with carrots, celery, or parsnips, as well as some citrus fruits and figs that also make furanocoumarins. And that's because regardless of where they come from, you experience this DNA damage as a condition called phytophotodermatitis. That's phyto for plant, photo for light, and dermatitis for skin problem. In response to light, your skin turns red and can develop nasty blisters and burns which can last for months. You can also end up with dark patches because your skin tries to compensate for the light-induced damage by producing the pigment melanin to absorb some of the rays. Even after the initial burns heal, the affected skin can be sensitive to light for years. And if all that's not awful enough, giant hogweed isn't just bad news for us. It can spell trouble for native plant communities too. Each plant produces more than 20,000 seeds when it flowers, which it does just once. That's a lot of potential baby hogweed plants. As they grow, they can form tightly packed stands. And once established, giant hogweed lives up to its name, hogging all the resources for itself. Its huge size and giant leaves allow it to shade out and eventually eliminate its neighbors. And studies suggest it may even poison neighboring plants by sending toxins through the soil. If so, that means it engages in chemical warfare on multiple fronts, but the evidence is mixed. Given all this, it might be hard to understand why gardeners brought such a horrific plant around the world in the first place. But not all non-native plants become giant hogweed-level menaces, so they probably didn't see all this coming. Scientists are still figuring out why some non-native plants become invasive, meaning they cause serious harm ecologically, economically, or to human health, when others don't. Giant hogweed has some characteristics that are often considered typical of aggressively invasive plant species, like it produces a lot of seeds and grows really fast. But it lacks others, like that those seeds aren't readily dispersed long distances by birds and such. Of course, no one plant has every characteristic that makes it a good invader, and multiple strategies can lead to success in a new ecosystem. So, by studying species like giant hogweed, researchers can better predict what garden favorites will wreak havoc. In the meantime, if you spot something you think might be a giant hogweed, take some photos and send them to your local environmental authorities. In the US, many states have invasive species task forces for this kind of thing. Or, if nothing else, you can talk to someone at the nearest national or state park or national wildlife refuge. And other countries usually have similar people you can inform. Whatever you do, don't try to get rid of it yourself. Really, just don't. Trust us.
So invasive species can come in all shapes and sizes, and it's also not limited to the natural world. There have been artificial invasive species too, like the crayfish clones that took over Europe.
Imagine waking up one morning to find your pet crayfish had multiplied like an invasion of 10-legged aquatic tribbles, even though it was the only animal in the tank it had been for quite some time. It sounds impossible. Something out of a sci-fi movie. What is this hypothetical you're presenting to us, Hank Green? I'm presenting to you the exact story a German aquarium owner told scientists in 1995. And in 2003, a paper in the journal Nature confirmed it. This new crayfish population was made entirely of asexually reproducing all-female clones. Now, they're taking over. Plot twist. Many researchers think this crayfish should be considered a new species, and they've dubbed it Procambarus virginalis, but it's more commonly called the marmor crabes, or marbled crayfish. Instead of being produced in some top-secret diabolical clone lab, it probably arose thanks to a simple mutation. Normally, crayfish have two sets of chromosomes that carry their genetic information, one inherited from each parent. But sometime in the 1990s, a single crayfish was born with three sets, one from one parent and two from the other. Scientists think the parents were a different type of crayfish native to the Florida Everglades, and that one of them passed along the extra chromosomes through a mutated sex cell. Having entire extra sets of chromosomes is typically fatal in animals, but for some reason, this baby was a healthy female. It was just different. Specifically, it didn't need to partner to mate. Unlike all other kinds of crayfish, it could reproduce asexually through a process called parthenogenesis, laying hundreds of eggs that were exact genetic copies of itself. Then, each of those eggs grew up to be another self-cloning female that started taking over, Tribble style. If you haven't seen The Trouble with Tribbles, the Star Trek original series show, that's because you're not old like me. If the new species had stayed confined to aquariums, the marbled crayfish would have been nothing more than a genetic researcher's oddity and an aquarium hobbyist's nightmare. Unfortunately, though, the rapidly multiplying clones made it out into the wild, likely on a bunch of separate occasions where they now live and copy themselves over and over and over. Because only one individual is needed to start a new population and every individual is fertile, marbled crayfish can rapidly overrun new environments and leave native species in the dust. Since its discovery, this crayfish has spread through Europe and Africa and has even appeared as far away as Japan. To prevent them from invading even more areas, the European Union and some US states have banned them from being sold, but we probably won't see them disappear anytime soon. Besides their uncanny ability to multiply, some people still intentionally release marbled crayfish, like some farmers in Madagascar who raise them for food. And in some places, it's still possible for aquarium hobbyists to buy them. Getting rid of invasive species is a huge undertaking, especially when every single individual can restart the population. So if you find yourself admiring a marbled crayfish at your local aquarium supply shop, consider what you'll do to responsibly care for your future clone army, and then kill it right there in the store. Don't do that.
Alright, so invasive species are pretty intense. They can really do a number on the existing organisms in a natural space. But here's why it's so hard to combat them.
Eradicating a species might sound like something that's always bad. We put a lot of time and money into protecting life on Earth, not destroying it. But not all eradication plans target a species' entire population, just the parts that end up in places we don't want them to be. Invasive species can completely wreck an ecosystem, and we've tried all kinds of different ways to get rid of them over the years. But some of those efforts kind of backfired. spectacularly. Take, for example, Australia's poster child for invasive species, the cane toad. Native to southern and Central America, this toad is huge, averaging between 12 and 15 centimeters, and will eat almost anything, from carrion to insects to that bowl of cat food you left outside. They'll also eat smaller frogs and toads, snakes, snails, and small mammals. Basically, if it fits in the toad's mouth and it can catch it, it'll eat it. Maybe the saddest part of the cane toad story is that they were introduced to Australia on purpose. Farmers brought them in the 1930s to control the beetles eating their sugarcane crops. Unfortunately, the toads didn't stay in the sugarcane fields and started spreading across the continent. In their native environment, the toads are eaten by local fish, reptiles, birds, and bugs, but in Australia, there are few predators that can eat them safely. Cane toads are poisonous, and predators not adapted to their poison often die after eating them. The toads can also spray poison from glands on their shoulders, which can cause intense pain and temporary blindness in humans, making it both difficult and unpleasant to catch them. And when it comes to breeding, they're like warty hopping tribbles. Females lay clutches of up to 35,000 eggs at a time and can lay 2 clutches a year. Even though less than 1% of the eggs make it to maturity, that's still a huge number of baby toads to deal with. Add all of this together, and it's not hard to see why estimates put the number of cane toads in Australia in the hundreds of millions. And despite efforts to control them, they're spreading, moving into 40 to 60 kilometers worth of new territory every year. But there may be some hope for killing off the toads in one of Australia's native species, meat ants. These little guys can kill and eat toads without being affected by their poison, and since the toads aren't native to Australia, they don't know to watch out for the ants. If scientists can encourage meat ants to colonize places where the toads like to hang out, it's possible they could make an impact on the toad population. Some people have also considered bringing in some of the toad's natural predators, but that's a risky proposition considering importing non-native predators is what got Australia into this mess in the first place. The same control problems have happened with other invasive species too. During the age of colonization, ships carrying explorers often brought along stowaways like mice and rats. So to control them, sailors often introduced foreign predators to take care of the pests. You know the phrase, 2 wrongs don't make a right? That's super applicable here. One popular import was the small Indian mongoose, a voracious predator that was introduced throughout the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean, Japan, and the Mediterranean to control invasive rodent and native snake populations. The mongoose was a favorite because it will eat practically anything it can catch, and anyone familiar with Rikki-Tikki-Tavi knows that a mongoose can catch just about anything. That ability was a problem though, because besides invasive rodents, they'll also eat plants, fruit, and eggs, making them a nightmare for native wildlife. The mongoose is credited with the extinction of nearly a dozen species across the globe, which was really not what the explorers who introduced them had in mind. And they carry rabies, in case you needed another reason to wonder why we ever thought introducing them everywhere was a good idea. Obviously, it's best to just avoid introducing foreign species in the first place, but it is possible to eradicate them if you're really dedicated. What happened on Macquarie Island, halfway between Australia and Antarctica, gives you some idea of just how difficult eradication can be, but maybe also some hope. When the island was discovered by an Australian explorer in 1810, it became a hub for seal and penguin hunting. Ships full of hunters brought along mice and rats, which threatened their food stores, so sailors brought in cats to control the rodents. Fast forward 60 years, when another foreign species was introduced, the rabbit. It was an old tradition meant to provide sailors with food in case a shipwreck stranded them on a deserted island. Of course, rabbits multiply incredibly fast, and with lots of tasty rabbits around, the cats multiplied too. By 1970, there were more than 100,000 rabbits decimating Macquarie Island's plant life, and the cats had hunted 2 species of birds to extinction. Conservationists were so concerned about the rabbit problem that they introduced yet another foreigner to the party, a rabbit disease called myxomatosis. It was fairly successful, reducing the rabbit population to less than 20,000 within a decade. But with fewer rabbits to hunt, the cats became even more dangerous to Macquarie's native bird population. By 1985, they'd done enough damage that conservationists began a campaign to shoot and kill all the cats. You can probably guess where this is going. In 2000, the last cat on Macquarie was shot, and in less than a decade, the rabbit population was so out of control they'd stripped nearly half the island bare. To prevent even more damage, the Tasmanian government approved a $17 million program to hunt down and kill every rabbit, mouse, and rat on the island. The first wave of the project kicked off in 2011, spreading poisoned rodent bait all over the landscape. That killed off the rats, mice, and many of the rabbits. Then, to kill off the remaining rabbits, they brought in the dogs. Before you facepalm too hard, the dogs were specially trained rabbit hunters that left the island with their trainers. In April of 2014, after 2 centuries of damage, the eradication was complete. So there might be hope for controlling some of the other invasive species causing problems all over the world. But what's happened in cases like these has taught us a lot about just how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive those efforts can be, and how badly they can backfire. So next time you hear a story about unwanted pets being dumped into sewers, think less mutant ninjas and more ecological nightmare.
Yeah, so dealing with invasive species can get out of hand pretty fast. But we don't always need to get rid of them. Here is the upside of some invasive species. Invasive species are bad, right? At least that's what you always hear. Like, take the brown tree snakes that accidentally showed up on the island of Guam around 1950. With no natural predators, these snakes reproduced like crazy and ate everything they could get their imaginary hands on. After a few years, they had wiped out the majority of Guam's native forest birds. So, not good. These kinds of non-native species are generally referred to as invasive, and they're usually considered some evil that needs to be eradicated from their new homes. But not all non-native species are totally terrible. Here are 6 of them that can actually do more good than harm. One of the most surprising examples of a helpful invasive species is the horse. Many people don't realize that horses are non-native to the United States, because they've been living in the US for so long. But they haven't always been here. Although the genus Equus did evolve in North America, all the horse's ancestors were extinct from the continent around 10,000 years ago, and we still don't know exactly what happened. Horses only returned to the area in the 15th century, thanks to the Spanish colonizers. But even then, their comeback wasn't all sunshine and roses. Many of these horses escaped and became feral, animals that were once domesticated and have since run wild. And today, many groups consider them an invasive species. These horses compete for the land and resources used by other animals, and they have a tendency to smash vegetation and damage plants by overgrazing. Still, when these feral horses are removed from the wild and trained, they become some of our most helpful partners. For centuries, domestic horses have been invaluable in moving people and supplies around the US, and parts of the country likely wouldn't have been settled as quickly without them. Even today, hundreds of feral horses are taken in and trained each year, and even though fewer people are using them to explore the country, they're still doing important work on farms and ranches. And as a bonus, they're not out there wrecking the plant life. Of course, lots of them are still causing trouble in the wild, but at least some of them have found more productive roles. Of course, no matter how many plants they eat, people still love horses. The same can't be said for another non-native species called the tamarisk shrub. In the 19th century, various species of this shrub were introduced to the southwestern US from Eurasia and Africa. And initially, most people were pretty cool with it. The shrubs prevented soil erosion, and they served as both ornaments and as sources of shade. And since they were drought resistant, they certainly didn't mind living in their new home. But then their reputation kind of tanked. When the area's water supplies began to run low in the 1930s, the shrubs were accused of being water thieves. They were even called alien invaders during World War II. People kicked off decades of eradication efforts to try and get rid of these plants, but as it turns out, they might have just gotten a bad rep. Several studies have since concluded that the tamarisk's water use isn't significantly different from that of native tree species. And the shrubs are also doing some good in the world. Specifically, they're beneficial to a type of native bird called the southwestern willow flycatcher. These birds live in the vegetation alongside rivers and streams, things like cottonwood and willow trees, but they've become endangered as the water has been diverted for other uses and the vegetation has disappeared. Thankfully, the tamarisk shrub came to the rescue. According to recent research, up to 75% of southwestern willow flycatchers have found new homes in tamarisk shrubs, at least in some spots. The studies also suggest that babies raised in tamarisks were just as successful in life as those from nests built in native trees. So it seems like the tamarisk isn't such a villain after all. If you spent any time exploring the outdoors, you might have come across a bunch of stringy flowers called honeysuckle. There are a few different species, and they're native plants in many parts of the world, but not central Pennsylvania. Honeysuckle probably wasn't introduced there until the 1800s, but it's now thriving in a region pleasantly called Happy Valley. In fact, its fruit makes up more than half of all the fruit found in the area. Although this non-native plant does compete for resources with the locals, it doesn't seem to be causing too much trouble. In fact, it's really helping out the birds. A few years ago, researchers started some very dedicated note-taking, comparing bird and plant data from urban, agricultural, and forested areas. And they found that the amount of honeysuckle predicted both the numbers and diversity of birds within their studied region. In other words, the more honeysuckle, the more birds, and more types of them. The team actually determined that the honeysuckle and bird communities had formed a mutualistic relationship, where the birds would eat their fruit and poop out the seeds elsewhere. One gets nutrients it needs to live, and the other gets to spread around its seeds. The honeysuckle has improved the lives of other native plants, too, like nightshade. In one experiment, birds removed 30% more nightshade fruit in areas full of honeysuckle, compared to areas without the invasive plants. That's because these birds aren't picky eaters, so when they stop by for some honeysuckle, they nom on some nightshade fruit too. It's more than a win-win. It's a win-win-win. At least for these three. You might not have heard of it, but one of the most hated invasive species around the world is the European green crab. It's originally from the Northeast Atlantic Ocean and Baltic Sea, but it's now colonized many of the world's coastlines, spreading on ships and ocean currents. And it's a total troublemaker. These crabs chase off and kill native species, and they eat basically everything. You might even say they're acting a little shellfish. But there's one area of the world where they might be doing a little bit of good: Cape Cod. European green crabs arrived in New England over a century ago and began their usual terrorizing routine, but things in the region have changed a lot since then. Over the years, recreational fishing and crabbing have taken out a lot of the native species in the area, including the predator to the native purple marsh crab. Without any enemies to munch on them, these crabs then overate the local cordgrass and dug so many burrows that soil erosion dramatically worsened. But fortunately, the purple marsh crabs are no match for the little green invaders. Studies have found that in places where green crabs have made a home, the ecosystems are recovering from the damage done by the overpopulating native crabs. Basically, this invasive species is a violent bully. Green crabs either outright kill or just scare the marsh crabs so they spend most of their time hiding. When researchers stuck both species in the same cage, the green crabs evicted the marsh crabs from their burrows and over 85% of them died. Another month-long test showed that the mere presence of a single green crab caused marsh crabs to spend basically the entire time hiding, even if the green crab was locked up. By the end of the month, the marsh crabs had eaten much less cordgrass than usual. It's kind of like a crab cage match. 2 crabs enter, 1 crab leaves. Another coastal invader that's helped improve damaged ecosystems is gracelaria vermiculophylla, a seaweed native to waters near Japan. Over the years, it's spread around the North Atlantic, likely due to the export of oysters, and you can now find it scattered across beaches looking like gross bunches of matted hair. Besides outcompeting native algae for resources, this seaweed can also form dense mats in places like shallow bays and estuaries, which get in the way of all kinds of stuff. These mats do things like blocking light from reaching lower photosynthetic life, decreasing the amount of oxygen, and shifting current flows, which affects how food settles for deposit feeders. However, studies have shown that where native habitats have declined or disappeared for other reasons, gracelaria provides some much-needed vegetation. It can bring back the area from the brink of barrenness. Other algae and small immobile animals can attach to it, and it can provide shelter and food for other critters, like gastropods, crustaceans, and other small invertebrates. Outside the water, the seaweed is also widely used in agar production, a gelatinous substance used as a food thickener and in petri dishes. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but we're glad it's doing some good out there. And finally, sometimes we intentionally take species and bring it to a new land to help. This can totally backfire, but in the case of the Aldabra giant tortoise, everything seems to be working out okay. Giant tortoises are a trademark of the Galapagos, but they're also found on islands in the western Indian Ocean. Initially, 2 main groups lived on these islands: the giant tortoises inhabiting the Seychelles, and those living on the Mascarene Islands east of Madagascar. And then humans showed up. By the mid-1800s, nearly all of the tortoise species on the islands had been knocked out. Many were over-harvested by humans, and others had their young killed by invasive cats, rats, or dogs. In the end, only the Aldabra giant tortoises survived. They live in a place appropriately called Aldabra in the Seychelles. It's an island atoll, or land linked up by a ring-shaped coral reef. It's pretty isolated from the other islands in the area, and an atoll doesn't have enough space for human settlement, so that's probably why it currently has the largest population of giant tortoises in the world. And now some of them have been purposefully transplanted to other islands where their tortoise cousins no longer exist. For example, islands in the Mascarene, like one called Mauritius, have seen a decline in certain fruiting plants because their seeds are no longer being distributed by extinct native tortoises. So in the year 2000, a group of Aldabra giant tortoises were brought to the island, and now they're chowing down on the local flora, pooping seeds out all over the place. In fact, their digestive process actually helps break down the protective outer coating of some of these seeds, which makes the chance of germination higher. The tortoises are also successfully breeding on the island, and there have been similar success stories in other places in the Mascarene too. All these species make you wonder if it's time to retire the term invasive species. After all, none of them, whether they're good or bad for their new environment, are actively choosing to invade. There's no green crab or seaweed generals ordering their troops around. They're just plants and animals that wound up in a new land that's way easier to live in. Either way, these non-native creatures shouldn't all be painted with the same brush. And by studying them rather than immediately trying to remove them, we might be able to find ways to help protect struggling ecosystems. So, some invasive species are super harmful to their new ecosystems, while others seem to help out. It turns out each invasive species fits into its ecosystem in a unique way. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow, and thank you to our awesome community of patrons who make these videos possible. If you want to learn more about supporting free science education on the internet, you can check out patreon.com/scishow.